Okay, the next important thing we have is when the Romans pull out, and this is going to change the destiny. It was when the Romans pulled out, changed the whole destiny of the British Isles. 410 A.D. And that's about where we were last time. We had said a lot of other things about the introduction of Christianity there, but the beginning of the 5th century is about where we stopped, and the same place is about where we want to start this morning. The Romans withdraw in the first part of the 400s A.D., the beginning of the 5th century, around 410 A.D. And this is what's going to forever change the history of England, what brought England as we know it today to be England. And, well, England's a more popular name today rather than Great Britain, and I will show you why here in a moment. All right, that's very brief, but that's an outline of the British Isles and of the introduction of Christianity there. The whole time while the Romans are in occupation, they introduce their gods. Remember, they push out the Druid religion, the old Druid religion of the Celtic people, which they had brought from their homelands, various islands around, to Great Britain. They pushed that out, introduced their pagan Latin pantheon, and that has some influence on some of the people, obviously, but many of the people are already Christian by this time. Perhaps earlier in the introduction of Christianity, earlier in that phase there, it's a more pure form of Christianity than it is by this time, where you have a lot of ecclesiastical introductions into their particular form of Christianity. But be that as it may, it's the pull-out of the Romans which is going to change everything. Whenever they pull out, that obviously leaves a vacuum. And the reason that they pull out is because the Roman Empire itself, the Mediterranean Roman Empire itself, is on the decline. It's going to collapse in 66 years, in 476 A.D. So they've got to pull those troops out to try to make a last-ditch stand on other borders, especially over into the continental sphere, where they have these various pagans and barbarians invading the Roman Empire. However, whenever they pull out of Great Britain, it leaves a vacuum there. It leaves a power vacuum, a military vacuum, a governmental vacuum. The Celtic people were just local, indigenous people. The Romans were in control militarily and politically of all of the British Isles, and particularly in southeastern England, because that's where the English Channel is, and it's easy enough to cross from France over into Great Britain. So what happens? Well, if you pull out and leave a power vacuum there, someone's going to come in and try to take your place. And that's the next thing that happens. From the north, the invading Picts and Scots come down. They invade Great Britain, fill in that void, that vacuum left by the withdrawal of the Roman troops, and begin to slaughter the Celtic people. They seem to have brought in, they were, a barbarous group of people where the Romans were said to be civilized. They just slaughtered the people whenever they came in. And so the local Britons, spelled with an O-N, remember, the local Britons who had depended on locally stationed Roman troops to keep out invaders. Invaders had attempted to come in, but the Romans had kept them out. But this dependence the Britons couldn't have anymore because the Romans weren't there anymore. Since they don't have Roman troops locally stationed, garrisoned around to depend upon to keep the Picts and Scots and other invaders out, then they have to call for help from another source. And the people they called for were the Jutes and the Saxons, who came from the continent, who, if you again go back to your Indo-European list of languages, the Eastern family and the Western family, down at the very bottom, you'll see Low German, and we've developed it. Old Saxon, Low German, Dutch, Flemish, Anglo-Saxon, which is the same as Old English, Middle English, and English. In other words, you ought to be able to see that these people fit there, at least with this term, Saxon. So if you want to put number 6, and then I'm running out of room, the Jutes, J-U-T-E-S, and the Saxons. J-U-T-E-S and the Saxons, S-A-X-O-N-S. Come in not so much as invaders. We really shouldn't think of them so much as invaders. They come in as deliverers. Because the Britons are asking for help from someone. It can't be from the Romans. Their empire is going down the drain, and they're more concerned about the northeastern fortification of their Mediterranean world empire boundaries and borders than they are this little place over here, which is way at the northwest of the Roman Empire. And so the Jutes and the Saxons are not so much invaders. They're they're deliverers. They're supposed to be allies of the British people because they come in to drive out the Picts and the Scots. But then if you drive out the Picts and the Scots, there's another vacuum there. And someone else is going to try to fill that vacuum. And of course the odds would be those people, that someone would be the Jutes and the Saxons. The very people who came in to drive them out would probably stay there once they had driven them out. And that's exactly what happened. The Jutes were mighty warriors from the continent, we mean from Europe, who stayed once they were invited and fulfilled their task. They stayed. The Saxons were mighty warriors, and they stayed as well. And England forevermore has been influenced not so much by the invasion of the Jutes and Saxons, but by them coming in as allies to aid the Britons in expelling the invading Picts and Scots. So if you picture that thus far, you have a good grasp just on English history, and how it's developed since then is entirely on the basis of the Jutes and Saxons and one other group I'll mention here in a moment. These three groups of people who found their way into the country as deliverers, as military deliverers, to deliver the people from the Picts and from the Scots. And once they came, they stayed. They were invited guests. And you can hardly invite a country in or a peoples in, especially Jutes and Saxons, who are barbarians themselves, by the way, and say, come in, drive these people out, and then please go back home again. You're going to have to get something for your work. And if you don't get payment, and what's money anyway? The payment they want is the land. If you don't get payment, you stay and occupy the territory. Remember, that's what happened in the Second World War. The Russians were invited in, and we made some strategically important miscalculations in our discernment and ascertaining of the psychology of the Russian people. And after having them being so successful in the Second World War and overrunning much of Eastern Europe and not playing our cards as we should have concerning especially the city of Berlin, that once they came in, they stayed. If you remember the Second World War. And we've never gotten the Soviet Union, the Russians, out of there since that time. They took over Bulgaria and Yugoslavia and Romania and Poland and Germany, part of Germany. Our mistake was with Berlin. That's an interesting study in itself. But I guess that's just the history of warfare and the history of armies of the world. But if you invite them in and you don't give them a king's ransom to leave, they're going to take their own ransom, which will probably be they'll occupy your territory. So anyway, that's kind of what we did, although we weren't, fighting in a war or something. We came and occupied the Indians' territory here, and if Great Britain would have won the Revolutionary War, I'm sure the United States of America would be part of that far-flung British Empire. Once they would have come and subdued us, then they would have taken this country and settled it. So that's just a history of people, I guess. And we should have known better. They should have studied English history, and the English people were the ones so involved with Churchill in the war, and they should have realized. But anyway, the Saxons come in, they settle in the southern part of England, and hence we get our district known as Sussex, S-U-S-S-E-X. They settle in the west. What do you think of the name of it becomes? Wessex. They settle in the east. You can fill in the name. What would the name be? Essex. If you write me down at school, that's the name of our street. New England. New England has been profoundly influenced by England, which was profoundly influenced by the Saxon people. Anywhere around the school down there, anywhere around Boston, you've got a Sussex, a Wessex, an Essex. You've got all types of X's down there. It all came from the Saxons, the Saxon people. And people from England came over here and settled in New England and just took names from their mother country. They didn't invent new names, except to put the word new in front of it. New England. New Amsterdam. See, there was an Amsterdam, there was a New Amsterdam, although it has a new name today, of course. They settled in the western part. What would that be? Oh, wait a minute, I already gave you the west. The central part. Middlesex. You ever heard of that before? There's towns around called Middlesex. They didn't settle up north. The north was known as Northumbria. But they took the west, the south, the east, the central part. Sussex, Wessex, Essex, and Middlesex. In the year 447, and that's interesting to know as you travel around and you see these X's. We live on 130 Essex Streets where the seminary is located. Where'd you get a name like Essex? Who would ever name their child Essex? Where do you get a name like Essex? The Saxons. The Saxons. And it must have been east. And look where we are. New England is way over on the eastern side of the United States. But you could probably find towns. No doubt there's probably somewhere here in Vermont. We know how they name a city, Middlesex or whatever, and then they got a west, north, south, and east all around it. Maybe not here. If you get further over to the coast, like closer to the coast, you'll probably find something like that. That'd be great to do, because you'll never confuse it as long as you know the rising and the setting of the sun. 447, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a written record that dates to 447, middle of the 5th century, records some of these settlements, the ones that I've just given you. There's source material for that. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Anglo-Saxon, which then introduces us to this third group of people. We've said the Jutes. If you put down here number 6, the Jutes, the Saxons, and then either attach it onto that or put it onto another number 7, because they come a little bit later, the Angles. A-N-G-L-E-S. Pretty much just like it sounds, the Angles. The Angles came in 547. So they're about 100 years now. Remember, 410, the Romans pull out. Essentially right after that, let's say by 430, the Picts and the Scots are invading. And within a couple of decades, let's say by 450, the middle of the 5th century, 450 A.D., the Jutes and the Saxons come in. Then it's not until 547, about 100 years later, before the Angles come in. When they come in, they establish the Anglican kingdom. So just to help you, if I divide that up, we've got our Jutes and Saxons that are coming in around 450. We go up here to a number 7, we have our Angles. We're coming in around 547. And they established the Anglican kingdom. Now what have we gotten from a name like that? The Anglican Church of England. That's the name of the official state church of England, is the Anglican Church. And so they got it from their pagan forefathers. I guess you could baptize the name of your pagan forefathers and name your church that, the Anglican Church. Now these three groups of people, the Jutes, the Saxons, the Angles, were all Teutonic, or Germanic people, not Celtic. Celtic was a different group of people. They were all Teutonic. And they tended to come from northern Europe, which would be the lowlands, remember, which would be the Low German people, thus speaking the Low German language or dialect. So we've got these three groups of people in, the Jutes, the Saxons, the Angles, by the middle of the 6th century, 547, 550 A.D. Their purpose in coming in was not to rename or change the names of various places in England, but to drive the Picts and the Scots out. That was their purpose for coming in. Were they successful? Well, yes, they were. They were a strong people. The Angles probably were the strongest at this time, by the middle of the 6th century. And those three people, those three forces, and their combined strength, was enough to drive out the Scots and the Picts. And after driving them out, with the Angles being the more dominant of the three groups, then the country itself adopted the name of the people, and you can see what it became. Angleland, the land of the Angles. Hence the term England. England just a shortened form. You just take your G, your E, and grab your G, and you've got England. Became known as Angleland. So all of this took place, including the Picts and the Scots, let's say from around 430 to around 600. All of this, from the Picts and the Scots all the way up to Angleland becoming just that. From around 430 to around the beginning of the 7th century A.D. Okay, so there's just a little history for you so you can know some of these major early developments in Angleland. And the people over in England almost call their country that today. We say England, and for them, they talk entirely different than we do. And it's almost England. It's England. And it's almost an England. We just shorten it over here and call it England. We like to shorten things, and they draw things out. Of course, for our concern, or for our purposes, we're concerned about how did this affect Christianity in the country of England. Now we'll call it England. Earlier it was Britain, which came from another source I don't guess we need to get into. Earlier it was Britain, and of course it's still called Britain today. The names are really interchangeable. But it adopted this new name, so this is the newer of the two if you want to know the chronological order of the names Britain and England. But last time we looked at Christianity in Britain, now we're looking at the ReChristianization of England. And so it's not without purpose that as you'll get your tapes and you'll see on the tape list, the name has changed from Britain to England, just because that was a chronological change. So what we're looking at this morning is the ReChristianization of England. Well, that tells you something right away. The ReChristianization of England. How did it affect Christianity? The coming in of the Jutes, the Saxons, and then the mighty Angles? Well, in short, it affected Christianity greatly. To say nothing else, these people, the Jutes, the Saxons, and the Angles, were all thoroughly pagans. They came from way up in the northern parts of the continent of Europe. And they came from a non-Christian background. They were, as the people of their day would have spoken of them as, and as we, I guess, speak of them in like manner today, they were thoroughly barbaric people, pagans, barbarous souls, who, whenever they came in, obviously didn't agree with this Christianity business that had been dominant among the Celtic people, which had more or less been dominant even with the Romans there, and even with the Romans' form of religion had been dominant. So we're going to have not only now a shift in power and the struggle over that, but a shift in religion as well. Whenever they came in, we're talking, let's get up into the 6th century. They overran the country. They destroyed the Christian towns and churches. They destroyed monasteries. As a matter of fact, they went so far as to drive the Christians almost off the island into the ocean. They drove all of the Celtic Christians, and that was the name of the church in England at this time, the Celtic Church. It was still a Celtic church. They drove the Celtic people, the Celtic Christians, all the way over to the western part of the country. If you just picture the island of England now, and these Jutes and Saxons and Angles have crossed the English Channel, the closest part, the closest way that you have to go from the continent to England, would have pushed them beginning from the east, beginning in the southeast, in the district of Kent there, and pushed them all the way over to the western part of the island, and almost pushed them right into the sea. So here they stay for quite some time. They're pushed over here to the western part. This has been going on now from 430, or really up to 450, all the way up to 600, pushing them, destroying Christianity, so that the Celtic Church and the people here in England, the Christian people, the Christian churches here, over this period of time, for let's say a century and a half, from 450, because 430 is really the date of the Picts and the Scots. 450 is really the date of the Jutes and the Saxons, and 547, the date of the Angles. So for 150 years, a century and a half, from 450 to 600, the Christians, the Celtic Church in England, has had no contact with the continental church or with the Roman church. It has been, an island unto itself for about 150 years, which is going to really seriously damage relations between Christianity in England, the form of Christianity there, and the Christianity on the continent, whether it's a so-called Protestant form or whether it's a Romish form. So the Celtic Church has really suffered greatly meanwhile. For this 150-year period, the Celtic people and the Celtic Church has really gone through a baptism of fire. So we have a great break in relations, discontinuity, a lack of fellowship, a lack of agreement. And out of this comes various theological as well as liturgical divergences when you compare and contrast the church in England with the church on the continent. And the church in England almost goes under. Their flame is almost snuffed out. That is until two things happen. And that's what we want to major on for the rest of this morning. Two important events that do happen that save the church in England that I guess are why we are who we are today. Because had these people come in, I mean, no doubt, and by the way, notice that we don't speak the Celtic language, and the people in England don't speak the Celtic language. We have adopted the language and many of the ways and many of the customs of these Anglo-Saxon people. And whenever they came in, they overran the country. And they forced the Celtic language, which was the local indigenous native tongue of the people. They just pretty much forced that out of existence in England anyway. And as a result, I mean, we speak Anglo-Saxon. Anglo-Saxon is just another name for Old English. Anglo-Saxon and Old English are the same thing. And as that developed through Middle English to English today, modern English, we see how we have connections with those people then. We don't want their form of religion, because their form of religion is just base paganism. But you can't help but adopt many of the other things of those people. You can't help but adopt, I'm sad to say, over the process of the centuries of the church's history, some of their forms of religion. You get, I mean, this name right here. What does that look like to you? Easter. Estera that's an Anglo-Saxon term. It's the name of a Teutonic goddess that was sacrificed to in April and March of the spring of each year. And you can see right away where we get our name Easter. And I think we're sacrificing something around that time. What is the date for Easter, by the way? What day is it? Someone saying April? Someone saying March? Could it be either one? Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? This is when they celebrated this pagan feast here, the Anglo-Saxon people. And so since, we've got to invent, and we've covered this on the holiday tapes, but since we've got to invent this special time, we're going to do special homage to Christ and to His death. And the spring is fine, because that's when Jewish Passover falls, although they're going to have a different day than we Protestant or even Roman Catholic Christians might have. It's a springtime, but it's so interesting how the pagans of antiquity, it's almost as though people were not thinking, first of all, let's celebrate the death of Christ. Because why is it we just happen to have all these feasts in the pagan world that fall so neatly and so happily for us, right around Easter, right around Christmas, right around all these other dates? If you look at it like that, it's almost as though we weren't really wanting to celebrate the birth of Christ and just picked another name or another festival to attach it to. They wanted to celebrate that festival, but knew they couldn't under those terms, and so baptized it and brought it into a Christian formation then. If you reverse that, you have too many coincidences. While we happen to have pagan feast, the Feast of Saturnalia for the Christmas season, that fall at just the appropriate time for Christ's birth, according to what they said, and His death, and all of these other things as well. So, Anglo-Saxon term, that's the name of a Teutonic Germanic goddess from the Low German people. And the people here in England want to continue, they want to celebrate. These are Anglo-Saxon people. And some of them remember, a semi-form of Christianity once they come over. I mean, some of them are pagan, obviously. We're going to look in just a moment at their Christianization, though. But their Christianization is kind of suspect and semi-spurious, totally spurious in many people's lives. And so they're wanting to hold to these old customs and these old festivals of theirs. And they want to hold to that, and they find something in the life of Christ or the Old Testament history or the New Testament history. It's not just they're trying to celebrate something that relates to Christ. They've got to find something. If they can't find that, it'll be the birthday of Moses or something that can fall around that time of the year, and we'll baptize that and Christianize that and call it a Christian holiday. And yet we'll keep all the same forms of the old pagan festivals, which is exactly what's happened, which is what makes those holidays so sinful for Christians to participate in. Because, like I say, they were never invented out of a sincere desire to worship Christ, whether His birth or His death or resurrection or the coming of the Magi or the fleeing into Egypt or whatever. They pick everything and have a feast day and festivals for all of these things. And as history goes on, we have more saints that come on the scene and do great deeds, even deeds of supererogation, and then finally are martyred, and we have more days to celebrate because we have saints' days then. Well, anyway, I said that there's a great cleavage and a discontinuity between the form of Christianity in England and the church as such in England and the church on the continent, including the Roman church, until two things happen. Two important things change the tide in England, and the current tide in England is this flood of paganism, almost pushing the people right off the island into the Atlantic Ocean. First of all, we have the coming of Augustine. We have the coming of Augustine. Now, there are two Augustines in church history. One of them is the famous theologian from North Africa, the Bishop of Hippo, who wrote City of God, who wrote Confessions, who wrote works on the Trinity, who corresponded with Jerome. That's one Augustine, who lives around 400 A.D. There's a second Augustine who lives 200 years later, around 600 A.D. And he's the so-called apostle to the English people. And he's the one that we'll be discussing now. So he's not the famous one that you know from earlier studies from North Africa, the Bishop of Hippo. It's another Augustine. Now you say, well, how should or how do we distinguish these two? Well, one popular way is to distinguish these two men. They're spelled the same, Augustine, by the pronunciation of the name. Where generally the former of those, the Bishop of Hippo, is known by many people as Augustine, and the second one is known as Augustine. That's one way to distinguish the two. However, if you look up in any dictionary, you'll find both of their names, the first pronunciation is Augustine. The second pronunciation for the earlier one, the Bishop of Hippo, is Augustine, is the second dictionary pronunciation. The first one is Augustine. So probably what people have done, since they both are known as Augustine, pronounced the same, spelled the same, different times, different people who had different missions in life, they took the second pronunciation of the first one to distinguish the one from the other. Haven't you heard him referred to sometimes as Augustine? And maybe you grew up pronouncing him as Augustine. Well, that's fine. That's one way to distinguish the two men. Or you can distinguish them from just knowing what period of history you're talking about and what event in history. If we're talking about some type of theological writing, we're talking about your Augustine, the first one. If we're talking about a missionary who was sent by the Pope in Rome to re-Christianize England, we're talking about the second one. So what am I going to do? I call them both Augustine, since that's the dictionary pronunciation of both. But I just will distinguish them by what we're talking about. It ought to be obvious. One's a missionary, one's a bishop, church writer, theologian. So we're talking about the missionary one now. Okay, so back to this man. He's one of the two things that happens that changes the course of history and events in England. For 150 years, the Celtic Church has existed in the background. She gradually began to both have influence on her, what we could now call, I guess, invaders, supposed to be allies, but friends they were, both have influence on them and be influenced by them. The influence by them was, of course, in the language, in things like Estera, the Teutonic goddess of the springtime, sacrificed to in March or April, and other things like that. Her influence upon the Jutes and the Saxons and the Angles, of course, came in the form of her religion, Christianity. Then Pope Gregory the Great, in 596, sent Augustine, along with 40 monks, to re-Christianize England for the Roman Catholic Church. Now, Augustine was a little reluctant to go. He knew that the country had just recently, the Angles had only been there half a century now, relatively, just recently had been invaded by 3 groups of notorious pagans. And you'd rather take an army with you than 40 monks to do the job of re-Christianizing the country, which would be to, in the first place, Christianize these people who had never been Christianized before. Re-Christianize the country, in the sense, let's let Christianity take over for the second time the country of England. So he's rather reluctant to go. Whenever he gets to Gaul, which is about halfway there between Italy and England, he writes a letter back to Gregory, telling him that he's afraid and asks, in other words, to be let off the hook. But Gregory responds, no, you've got to go and convert those people. So he finally crosses the English Channel in 597. By the way, this Augustine is one of the most important people, maybe the most important man in English church history. I don't know, I guess you could argue for a lot of other people, but at least as far as early people are concerned, you wouldn't have those later people if you didn't have Augustine to come in and help re-Christianize the land. Christianity might have just been snuffed out. So he finally crosses in 597 into the territory of Kent, K-E-N-T, another one of those English terms. Kent is the southeastern section of England. Okay, the Anglo-Saxon king in Kent. There are many kings in the various locales spread over the island. The Anglo-Saxon king there is named Ethelbert. One name, Ethelbert, B-E-R-T, one name, Ethelbert. You ought to recognize these names. You can just hear names. I mean, if it was Chang Wong Bing, you'd know around what part of the world that fellow lived in. You know it probably wouldn't be a Teutonic king or goddess over in England somewhere. But Ethelbert, that's a good Anglo-Saxon name. Ethelbert. It's a good Anglo-Saxon name. And if you've read any, and some of you evidently haven't read some of the, some English literature, if you have read some English literature, you'd be familiar with, maybe not this man, but you see names, either this name or names like this all the time. And so you just grow accustomed to, you can tell when you're talking about something that has to do with the Scottish or the Irish or the English people versus the Koreans or the Chinese or the Japanese or the Chinese. Ethelbert had married a Christian princess. I mean, she became a princess whenever she got married, but had married a Christian girl. And this marriage was known by Pope Gregory back in Rome. And that evidently is why he thought the time was right to go and re-Christianize England. Augustine didn't know all about this. Gregory had withheld some important privy information. I guess, to make it more of a trial of faith. Because he just is going in as far as he knows in the midst of a group of pagans. But Gregory knows about this marriage, that the king of an Anglo-Saxon people, they're a powerful people here, that the king of the Anglo-Saxon tribe in the southeastern portion of England, Kent, happened to have recently been married to a Christian princess. And of course she would be influencing him toward Christianity, and Gregory just put two and two together and figured out this is the right time. England is right now for re-Christianization after a century and a half, 150 years of pagan domination. So he comes in. Augustine is fairly successful here in Kent, and as a result he becomes the first Archbishop of Canterbury from 601 to 604. Canterbury is another part, a see almost in Kent. Augustine becomes the first Archbishop of Canterbury. There's still Archbishops of Canterbury down to this day. Look how long ago this was, 601, 1,500 years ago. It was a long time ago. Now all of this information is recorded in Venerable Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English Nation and People. We'll talk about Venerable Bede later on when we get into actual translations. B-E-D-E. But he's probably the most famous historian of ancient English lore and legend, as well as maybe a little history. Venerable Bede, an ecclesiastical history of English people and their nation. So we've got the Celtic Christian people now having contact for the first time after 150 years with Roman churchmen. They've been separated by the invasion of the Picts and Scots, and then the, quote, invasion, unquote, of the Jutes, the Saxons, and the Angles. And of course, because they'd been separated for so long, they had come to differ over many items. One of those items being the correct date for the celebration of Easter. And this argument went on for quite some time. It was supposed to be settled in the middle of the 7th century. I'll give you a little bit of that history here in a moment, but that has gone on so that even today you have the Eastern Orthodox celebrating one day and the Western part of Christendom celebrating another day and the Jewish people celebrating another day. And whenever I was growing up, and I guess even today, I've always been a little aggravated over Easter because you never know what day it's on. At least you know December the 25th. You've got that day memorized, or October the 31st. You've got that day memorized. But what day is Easter on? You never know. You just wait until that year and get a calendar out and see, now, is it January or is it July this year? Or what month is it now this year that we're going to celebrate? It just goes back and forth. Not between those months, but the other two that you've already mentioned. You never really know when it's going to be celebrated. And that was due to a complex agreement that they came to eventually. And this was just through centuries of history now. The full moon of which month after which event, and then the next Tuesday after that, then count 3 Sundays after that, and then that will be Easter. And that's why it's so difficult to ever figure it out today. Most of us don't ever figure it out. We buy calendars that have those dates already written on them. We don't even try to figure it out. But the Jewish people, of course, their whole calendar was based on the system of the moons. The new seasons, the full moons. Passover was never on a day, like December the 25th. Passover, varied from one thing to another, depending on when the full moon was. And that's going to vary from one year to another. And so that, by the way, is what it's supposed to have been based on, the change of seasons and the celestial bodies there, rather than just say, let's nail it down to a day in March or a day in April. We'll go according to seasons. But it's been difficult to ever come to any conclusion on what is the proper day. And even with Christmas, you've got 2 different days from Eastern Orthodox to the Western world as well. But anyway, this was a big disagreement. I mean, people fought and died over this. It's a little ridiculous. That's why when we study this, we study this as Christian, quote unquote. We don't mean what we are right here. We mean religious pagans is what we mean. Religiously minded pagans. Can you imagine fighting? They would get in together in synods. They had a synod in Whitby here in the 7th decade of the 7th century. And they try to come to an agreement. And if they disagreed, these are mighty warriors, the Angles and the Saxons. They'd whip their swords out and murder one another over the disagreement and vote on what day. And that's no isolated incident. I'm not exaggerating it by any means at all. That happened time after time after time. And then people want us to study church history as though all these people were really Christian people. These were religiously minded, thoroughly pagan individuals. Religiously minded and thoroughly pagan. You imagine Christians are celebrating the birth of Christ, and let's add the death of Christ, Easter. Let's have a few more deaths while we celebrate this today. And so they start killing one another over that. Well, at the Synod of Whitby in 664, the Celtic people finally gave in to the Roman people and accepted their date for Easter. But there remained parallel with this a separated Celtic church to the north and west that kept their old date. It's almost like if people ever agreed about something, then they agreed to disagree about what they agreed about, just to have something to fight about. They disagreed about most things, but if you ever agree, you want to disagree about agreeing so that you'll have something else to fight about. And it's not stretching the story or not stretching the historical facts or the historical records at all to say that these people slaughtered and murdered one another over trivial questions. And by the way, some of the questions also over which blood was shed were not trivial, concerning doctrine of Christ or something. But, well, I guess the moral of the story is you can never, at the point of a sword, force a man to believe truth. He might profess it with his mouth, but he has his heart crossed or his fingers behind his back. If his life is on the line. And some of them, for your life to be on the line and you go through with it, That's great, because that's the gift of martyrdom, and you get more rewards in heaven. If you hold to your old erroneous pagan belief and you're killed over it, a lot of people just be killed for their beliefs rather than give up, rather than admit with their mouth but deny in their heart the reality of what you're saying, or to come to terms or agreement with you, because they thought that martyrdom would bring special rewards and special gifts in heaven. And so they would go ahead and die over things like that. So people who study church history, most people I've ever heard who've studied church history study it from the wrong point of view. They see all these people as great, mighty men of God. Augustine, the apostle to the English people, as great, mighty men of God. And a lot of these people, their salvation experiences are very questionable. Very questionable, especially people like this that we're talking about right now. Now I don't doubt someone like the first Augustine and his salvation experience, but even they're so far from apostolic practice and doctrine, it's a laughable matter. But that's what happened to the church when things went bad with them. So there's one thing that happens. Augustine comes in as the important, and he's Roman Catholic, of course, sent by Pope Gregory, as the important Roman Catholic apostle, quote unquote, to the English people. Then the second thing that happened was the coming in of the Celtic missionaries. And this is probably even more important than Augustine's work that he did. Now, some of the Celtic people had fled England and settled in monasteries in Ireland and Scotland. Many of them had just been pushed to the western side of the country, you remember. But many others had fled to monasteries, settled in monasteries in Ireland and Scotland. And then after the coming in of the Jutes, the Saxons, and the Angles, and thoroughly paganizing the country, many of these Celtic Christians who had gone to these monasteries then turned around as missionaries, or their children or grandchildren. Turned around as missionaries and came back to England to re-Christianize it. So you have it coming from two different angles. One from the Roman Catholic angle, sent by Pope Gregory, Augustine. Another from the Celtic angle, which is the original form of the church here, the original form of the people here from the time of David around 1000 BC. Coming from another direction, both trying to re-Christianize the country, not drive the pagans out, but Christianize the pagans that are there. Now the little island of Iona, I-O-N-A, off the coast of Scotland, became the chief center for Celtic Christianity by the late 500s. Again, around the same time as Augustine. The little island of Iona, I-O-N-A, off Scotland, on which an extremely important Celtic monastery had been established, had become the most important center for Celtic Christianity by the late 500s. Therefore, the missionaries which came forth from this island, from this monastery, from these Celtic Christians, were the most significant ones. Now, remember Augustine, whenever he came, he had worked on the Anglo-Saxon tribe in southeastern England, in the district known as Kent, because the king of that group of people, Ethelbert, had married a Christian, and he knew he would, once he got there, he knew he would do better there than anywhere else. Beyond Kent, the evangelization of England for the second time was not the work of Augustine. Augustine was only successful there in the southeastern portion. And by the way, that's probably the most important portion of England anyway, even down to this day. You find London right down there. London's down south, not way up north. And obviously you find Canterbury there. But beyond Kent, beyond the southeastern district of England, beyond Kent, the evangelization of England for the second time was not the work of Augustine, the Roman Catholic sent missionary, but the work of the Celtic mission from Iona. But it didn't start off well. Remember, whenever Augustine was sent to parallel the Celtic missionary beginning with that of Augustine, he got as far as Gaul, writing back saying he didn't want to go. And he was convinced by the Pope's authority and maybe thoughts of the afterlife that he better go. Well, the first Celtic missionary was sent by the request of the King of Northumbria. Now that's northern England, Northumbria, asking for monks to be sent from Iona to teach his people Christianity. They made the invitation. So the first monks that were sent returned home quickly, complaining that the people and their nature were just too barbarous. So we have a different impetus for the beginning of the Celtic missionary thrust as contrasted with that of Augustine, because the King of Northumbria asked that monks be sent to teach his people Christianity. Whenever they came, the late 500s, early 600s, they just found the people too barbarous to deal with. And so they went back. And then the next group that was sent a few years later was sent under a man named Aidan. A-I-D-A-N. A Celtic missionary, the counterpart to Augustine. And he was so successful that he became one of the most famous names in the English spread of the gospel, English evangelization. And this probably all was capped off by around the late 600s. So the invaders come in the 400s and 500s, and Christianity is reintroduced in the 500s and 600s. Now, I would say that probably the Celtic mission was the most important of the two. Augustine's name has gone down in history as being better known than that of Aidan, maybe because it's similar to the other Augustine in name, or maybe because of the ecclesiastical contacts that Augustine had with the Pope, Pope Gregory, the Pope in Rome, or the bishop in Rome. Whereas Aidan was just sent from this displaced group, this displaced people known as the Celtic Christians who had gone to Scotland and Ireland, particularly the island Iona off the coast of Scotland. So here's thus far what we've seen about English Christian history. It's there. You already know this. You don't need to write, but just listen and see if you've got these statistics down. Christianity is there by the 2nd century, even conceivably there by as late as early as the late 1st century. Flourished among the Celtic people until the mid-5th century. During all of this time, Latin was the language of the people. It was the language of the people whenever they wrote, anyway. Remember that, speaking of Latin, remember that the most important Vulgate manuscript, Omniatinus, the most important Vulgate Latin manuscript, happens to come from Northumbria. Now, it's probably, that's where it was done anyway, probably based on a manuscript that came from Italy. That's why we discuss it under the Italian group, the Italian family. But it was done in one of those monasteries, one of those twin monasteries, Jarrow and I forget what the name of the other one was, up in Northumbria. Very important place up there in northern England. The Romans leave in the early 5th century. The country is invaded by the Scots and Picts shortly thereafter. The Britons ask for help from the continent, and responding to that call for help would be the Jutes, and then the Saxons, and then a century later the Angles. Once they come, they stay, and they suppress Christianity for around 150 years. And during this time, the Celtic church and Christians and people have been pushed, some of them all the way over the western part of England, and some of them actually left. Probably the more religiously minded of those left and fled to Ireland and Scotland, where they founded Celtic Christian monasteries. So Christianity pretty much lies dormant and is dying on the vine for 150 years until the end of the 6th century, 596. Pope Gregory the Great, the Bishop of Rome, sends Augustine. He's successful in the southeastern part of England in re-Christianizing the country because of King Ethelbert and the fact that he had married a Christian princess. As far as the rest of the country is concerned, well, that would be due to the re-Christianization of that, due to the coming help from Scotland and Ireland, the Celtic missionaries. Okay, so summing everything up, we'll be through this morning. All this is done by the 7th century, the late 7th century. And still, have you noticed, we see no translation of the Bible into any vernacular tongue in England. Lest we get off of the point of our studying all of this, that is the purpose. We're talking about Bible translations. But we first of all have to get the Christian people there before we have a need for a Bible in their tongue. And all of these, now we've gone through 600-700 years of history, and no translation into the vernacular. Whether it's a Celtic vernacular, whether it's an Anglo-Saxon vernacular, we've got Latin, but Latin, that's just the regular writing language of the Mediterranean world at this time. No translation of the Bible into any vernacular tongue in England yet. And of course, that's probably because Christianity, the Christianity that had been there for all these centuries had been so long dependent upon Latin. And Latin, for the whole time the Romans were there, stayed the important writing language. There would be no reason for that to change. You say, yeah, but that would change whenever the pagans came in. That's true, but so would the need for any language as far as the writing of the Bible is concerned, because Christianity is suppressed. So during that period of history, you have no need of any translation because there are no Christian people around. And the ones who are over on the western part or in Ireland or Scotland, they might have Bibles in Latin and still be able to read their Latin because of their contacts with the Roman people. Now these people, the Picts and the Scots and the Jutes and the Angles and the Saxons, don't have contacts with the Roman people. They don't speak the English language, or the Latin language rather. They speak the old Anglo-Saxon tongue. And they don't have a Bible in their language because they're not Christian people. So it all makes sense whenever you understand all the ins and outs of that. But obviously, whenever these new people come in, the Romans have been gone now for 200 years. Very few people can speak Latin anymore. You're going to pick up the language of your conquerors. And what they're picking up is the language of the Anglo-Saxon people. And yet there's no Bible in that tongue. So here's how they saw that for a while. And this was done, by the way, right through history as well. They saw that by understanding the Bible from preaching, from poems, and particularly from pictures. Now this is a very interesting study in itself. Very interesting. They understood the Bible from preaching, from poems read, and from pictures. Okay, what are we talking about preaching? Well, depending on what time in history. Earlier, maybe some of the people knew enough Latin to keep up with some things that were being said. As we get later in history, when even the leaders don't speak Latin, they speak Anglo-Saxon, so do the people. So although there's no Bible, at least the people who are leaders have some type of Christian traditions passed down to them, and although they might not be able to read a Latin Bible, they can still preach in the Anglo-Saxon tongue that people can understand. Poems are the same thing. Pictures are definitely the most important because here you don't have to understand any language, but the language of art. Now I'm sure you're all familiar with the fact that throughout Europe, throughout England as well, we have tremendously huge, significant, ornate, beautiful, what we call cathedrals there. Now we've got one or two cathedrals around in this country, but they're nothing like what you'll find over in Europe. These are all modern things. You go over into Europe, you look at some of these cathedrals, you look at Canterbury, you look at some of these important Anglican or Roman Catholic sees, or even Protestant territories, anywhere in Europe, and you find one of these huge, important, not monasteries so much, but cathedrals, and you go inside that, and on the ceilings and on the walls are drawn these fantastically beautiful pictures. And then we people here in this country, we ask ourselves, now, why in the world do they go to all that trouble? Go in any Baptist church you want to. And you'll find an altar. You might find an American flag and a Christian flag. You might find a pews, an organ, some candles. But look around on the walls. Look on the ceiling. No pictures at all. Going to Baptist church, no pictures. Going to Presbyterian church, no pictures. I mean, maybe the head of Christ is out in the fellowship hall, the breezeway or something. You'll have a picture of Christ out there, but no ornate drawings and so forth. Why you have the need of all that back then? Because of illiteracy. You couldn't read. Many of the people couldn't read because there was nothing to read. And so when you can't read, you can't write. And so how are you going to learn about Christianity? Well, go in these places. You'll have the whole story of creation. There's God up in the clouds, and he's creating man down here. And the parents had been taught by their parents, by theirs, by theirs, by theirs. And they would take their children in. It was a fantastic experience to go through. But again, let's say Christian, quote unquote, sub-form of Christianity there, making all these images of God and Christ and the apostles and so forth. So when I say let's get into this and study this, get in with one foot, not both feet though. A lot of people get in with both feet and they adore things like that. It'd be worth going over there to look at, but it's essentially pagan art that's been baptized in this Christian form, you see. But the parents would take the hands of their little children on Sunday morning after services and walk through there and tell them the stories that were depicted there. And underneath the stories, what was taking place in that story, you'd have Latin writing. It'd be written in Latin telling you what took place. But very few people could read Latin. Some of the people who could read Latin actually learned by reading enough looking enough at the pictures, and then reading the language beneath it, and then finding another picture with the same form and the same Latin word, and pretty soon you picked up what that word meant. You saw it written there twice under an image that looked the same. That's why you have all these cathedrals over in Europe. That's why you have all these cathedrals over there in England, with all these fantastic pictures on the walls and the ceilings. And it was the weekend thing to do, to walk around in that and tell your children all of the Bible stories there. And that's kind of how and why today we have children's storybooks, we have pictorial Bibles and so forth. All of those things are just weak American imitations and substitutes for the great cathedrals over in Europe, where your child can't read, but you can show them the story, show them that big boat, and then this man, oh, that's Noah, and all the animals 2 by 2 by 2 coming into it. And you learn the story by picture rather than by the words. But for us, you see, it's interesting that God, he could have inspired this through artists to be all in pictorial form. It's in written form. It's the Word of God written, not the Word of God drawn in pictures. There must be an important reason behind that. Pictures they have their place, but they don't have a place in the Word of God, though, because it tends to distort your view of spiritual realities whenever it's so earthified for you that you can reach out and touch it. Well, here you got to struggle with that in your mind. Noah, and you try to get a picture of Noah. Well, what did he look like? You end up with no picture at all, except he was a man with a head, 2 arms, probably 2 arms, 2 legs, so many fingers, so many toes. What did he look like? And the boat, and what exactly did it look like? No one knows. And how is it positioned, and how did the animals get into it? No one knows. When you reduce all that to pictures, it tends to take away the beauty and the glory of all of that then. But yet other people are of just the opposite opinion. They think to put it in picture gives it glory and gives it beauty. But we'll argue in some other setting, I'm sure, that it tends to distort spiritual realities, though. It just tends to reduce everything to such an earthly level that it distorts the spiritual reality of it. Anyway, that's what they did. So, we really don't have a need for an English translation right now, although we could say that maybe these pictures in these cathedrals were initial small beginnings to actual translating work for the English people that will start just around the corner. And that's what we'll start looking at next week. We'll start getting into, or whenever we teach again, I'm assuming next week. That's when we'll get into first attempted English translations in. We just looked at the introduction of Christianity here among the people. But we'll look at some of those first very interesting, feeble attempts at translation that were done in metrical paraphrases by people like Kedman and later by people like Venerable Bede, and of course work our way up into modern translations. Okay, do you have any questions about all of that?
When do the Catholics start getting their doctrine distorted in the doctrine of crisis and other important doctrines? I'm thinking about, since they sent Augustine to England, when do they start getting distorted? know what their true Christianity.
Oh, they were distorted even at that time. I would argue ever since the death of the Apostle John, the church has been essentially distorted. And I would say that proof of that would be in the Apostolic Fathers, many of which many of you have read. If you have Lightfoot's book on the Apostolic Fathers, or Apostolic Fathers in some other form.